Somewhere, in a moment that probably felt unremarkable to you, a message went unanswered by choice rather than by delay. A call did not get returned within the anxious window it once would have. And for the first time in longer than you can clearly remember, you simply let the silence exist without rushing to fill it. You may not have even registered this as a turning point, but on the other side of that silence, something shifted, subtly at first, then increasingly hard to ignore. And today, we are going to walk through exactly what happens inside an avoidant mind once they realize the chase has genuinely stopped, and precisely what to expect as that realization settles in. Let's begin with what actually made this moment different from all the countless times before when your attention might have wavered briefly before returning to its usual anxious vigilance. Avoidant individuals develop, often over considerable time within a relationship, a remarkably accurate internal sense of how reliable someone's pursuit actually is, even when that sense operates far beneath conscious awareness. They learn, through repeated experience, exactly how much distance produces exactly how much anxious return, calibrating their own behavior, whether deliberately or not, around this predictable rhythm. When that rhythm genuinely breaks, when distance no longer produces the anticipated anxious return, this registers as something categorically different from your usual fluctuations in mood or availability. It registers as a disruption to a system they had, consciously or not, come to rely upon. Let's talk about the specific timeline of realization, because this rarely happens instantly, arriving instead through a gradual accumulation of disconfirmed expectations. The first instance of your reduced pursuit might register only faintly, easily dismissed as a temporary fluctuation, perhaps attributed to you being busy or momentarily upset, rather than representing any fundamental shift. The second instance registers slightly more strongly, beginning to accumulate as data rather than remaining an isolated anomaly. By the third or fourth instance, something more significant typically occurs: a genuine recalibration of expectation, an uncomfortable recognition that the previous pattern, upon which considerable unconscious security depended, no longer describes the current reality accurately. Let's talk about what happens specifically at the moment this recalibration crystallizes into full awareness, because this moment often produces a distinct, if brief, disorientation. For as long as your pursuit remained reliable, it functioned almost like background scenery within their internal world, present but unremarkable, precisely because its consistency required no active attention. Its sudden absence functions considerably differently, demanding attention precisely because absence, unlike consistent presence, requires active processing and explanation. This is why the realization that you have stopped chasing often produces a disproportionately strong reaction compared to how little seemed to change from your side, because what changed was not simply your behavior, but the disruption of an entire unconscious framework they had built around predicting your responses. Let's talk about the first common response that typically emerges once this realization fully settles: testing. This testing rarely announces itself as testing explicitly, appearing instead as behavior designed, consciously or not, to determine whether the shift is genuine or temporary. This might look like a slightly provocative comment, designed to see whether it still produces the anxious reaction it once reliably triggered. It might look like a period of increased distance, extending further than usual, checking whether this extended distance finally produces the anxious pursuit that previously would have arrived considerably sooner. It might look like reintroducing a topic or behavior that previously reliably triggered your anxious response, watching carefully for whether that same trigger still produces its expected effect. Let's talk about why this testing occurs, because understanding the underlying motivation helps you recognize it clearly, rather than becoming confused or destabilized by its appearance. Testing emerges from genuine uncertainty, rather than calculated cruelty in most cases. Having relied on a predictable dynamic for considerable time, the sudden disruption of that predictability creates genuine confusion that testing attempts to resolve. This is not necessarily manipulation in the deliberate, malicious sense many people assume. It is often simply an unconscious attempt to restore predictability to a system that has become confusingly unpredictable, seeking information about whether the old rules still apply or whether something has genuinely, permanently changed. Let's talk about what happens if this testing fails to produce the anxious reaction it was unconsciously seeking, because this outcome deserves particular attention given how significantly it often shapes what follows. When provocation, extended distance, or reintroduced triggers fail to produce your previous anxious response, something genuinely significant occurs within their internal calculation. The old system, the one where their distance reliably produced your anxious pursuit, has now been definitively disconfirmed, not through a single instance that could be dismissed as anomalous, but through repeated, consistent failure to produce the expected result. This repeated failure typically prompts a shift toward the second common response worth examining closely. Let's talk about this second response, increased effort, because this often surprises people who assumed, incorrectly, that reduced pursuit would simply produce reduced interest in return. Once testing has repeatedly failed to restore the previous dynamic, many avoidant individuals experience a genuine increase in effort, initiating contact more frequently than before, offering warmth or vulnerability previously withheld, sometimes even directly acknowledging, for the first time, some version of accountability for previous behavior. This increased effort often feels, to the person receiving it, remarkably validating, seeming to confirm that reduced pursuit was exactly the right strategy for finally producing the response they had been hoping for all along. Let's talk about why this increased effort deserves careful, measured interpretation, rather than immediate, uncritical acceptance as evidence of genuine transformation, because this distinction matters enormously for what happens next. Increased effort motivated primarily by loss aversion, the discomfort of losing access to something previously taken for granted, differs considerably from increased effort motivated by genuine internal growth and accountability. Both can look remarkably similar on the surface: increased contact, apparent warmth, even apparent vulnerability. The difference reveals itself not in the initial burst of effort, but in what happens once that effort has successfully restored some sense of security within the dynamic. Whether the effort continues at a sustainable, consistent level, or whether it gradually recedes back toward previous patterns once the immediate threat of losing you has been sufficiently soothed. Let's talk about the specific danger of interpreting this increased effort as proof that your reduced pursuit functioned as an effective strategy, prompting you to relax your own newfound boundaries the moment this effort appears. This interpretation risks recreating the exact dynamic your reduced pursuit was meant to interrupt in the first place, simply from a different angle, waiting anxiously now for their continued effort to persist, rather than waiting anxiously for their attention to arrive. Genuine security requires continued observation over meaningful time, not immediate relaxation of boundaries the moment initial positive signals appear, however encouraging those signals might feel in the moment they arrive. Let's talk about a third possible response worth examining, one that occurs less frequently than testing or increased effort, but deserves acknowledgement nonetheless: complete withdrawal, disguised as indifference. Some avoidant individuals, upon recognizing that their previous strategy of intermittent availability no longer produces anxious pursuit, respond not with increased effort, but with apparent, sometimes exaggerated, indifference, essentially doubling down on distance rather than attempting to close it. This response often stems from wounded pride, a defensive reaction to no longer holding the emotional leverage they had grown accustomed to possessing, protecting their own sense of control by appearing unaffected, rather than risking the vulnerability that genuine pursuit would require. Let's talk about how to distinguish this defensive, wounded pride withdrawal from genuine, healthy disinterest that might indicate the relationship simply is not meant to continue. Defensive withdrawal tends to include subtle inconsistencies, occasional check-ins despite apparent indifference, information gathering through mutual connections, evidence that they remain considerably more invested than their outward behavior suggests. Genuine disinterest tends to be considerably more consistent, complete absence of contact or curiosity, no lingering evidence of continued investment, even through indirect channels. Recognizing which pattern you are actually observing provides useful information about whether patience might eventually reveal something worth engaging with, or whether the relationship has genuinely, definitively concluded. Let's talk about what remains most important throughout all of these possible responses: testing, increased effort, or defensive withdrawal. Because your own stability throughout this entire process matters considerably more than accurately predicting exactly which response you will encounter. Regardless of which pattern emerges, your continued commitment to your own groundedness, your own boundaries, your own genuine investment in your own life, independent of their response, remains the foundation that protects you from being pulled back into anxious pursuit, regardless of how compelling any particular response might feel in the moment it occurs. Let's talk about the specific patience required to observe these responses over meaningful time before drawing any firm conclusions about what they ultimately indicate. A single instance of testing does not confirm permanent manipulation. A single instance of increased effort does not confirm genuine transformation. A single instance of apparent indifference does not confirm the relationship has definitively ended. Only sustained observation, across weeks or months rather than days, provides genuinely reliable information about which of these patterns represents lasting reality rather than a temporary reaction to the initial shock of your changed behavior. Let's talk about what happens to your own sense of power throughout this entire observation period, because power here deserves description as something considerably more valuable than simply predicting their next move accurately. Genuine power comes from no longer needing their response to determine your own emotional state, remaining steady and secure, regardless of whether they test, pursue, or withdraw. This power does not depend on correctly anticipating their behavior. It depends entirely on your own continued investment in your own well-being, remaining stable and grounded throughout whatever unfolds on their side of this dynamic. Let's talk about what happens if, after sufficient time and genuine observation, their increased effort proves sustainable and consistent, rather than temporary and reactive. If this outcome genuinely occurs, it represents something worth taking seriously: sustained, consistent change that has weathered the test of time, rather than simply the initial burst of energy that any threat to a comfortable arrangement typically produces. Even in this more hopeful scenario, continued discernment remains valuable. Watching whether this sustained effort extends into genuine vulnerability and accountability, or whether it remains primarily focused on restoring your availability without addressing the underlying patterns that produced this entire situation in the first place. Let's talk about a specific fourth response worth naming clearly, because it occurs frequently enough to deserve its own careful examination, separate from testing, increased effort, or withdrawal. This response involves a sudden, intensified interest in your life that appears almost investigative in nature. Questions about who you have been spending time with, subtle inquiries about whether you have moved on romantically, an uptick in curiosity that feels less like genuine reconnection and more like information gathering, designed to assess exactly how much ground has actually been lost. This response often stems from a specific kind of anxiety, not necessarily anxiety about losing you specifically, but anxiety about losing control over a narrative they had grown comfortable maintaining, the narrative in which they retained primary influence over the pace and direction of this relationship. Let's talk about how this investigative curiosity typically differs from genuine interest in reconnection, because the distinction matters considerably for how you interpret and respond to it. Genuine interest in reconnection tends to include vulnerability, actual disclosure of their own internal experience, actual curiosity about your well-being, expressed through sustained engagement, rather than pointed, narrow questions designed to extract specific information. Investigative curiosity tends to remain narrowly focused, extracting information without offering equivalent vulnerability in return, functioning more like reconnaissance than genuine emotional reconnection. Let's talk about what typically happens to communication patterns during this entire period of adjustment, because the actual mechanics of how contact occurs often shift noticeably once your reduced pursuit has been registered and processed. Messages that once arrived sporadically, whenever convenient for them, sometimes begin arriving with unusual promptness, an apparent eagerness to respond quickly that contrasts sharply with previous patterns of delayed or inconsistent communication. This shift, while potentially encouraging, deserves the same measured interpretation applied throughout this discussion. Evidence worth noting, but not yet conclusive regarding whether genuine, lasting change has actually occurred. Let's talk about the specific emotional experience of witnessing these various responses unfold, because this experience deserves acknowledgement as genuinely complex, rather than simply satisfying or vindicating. There is often a strange mixture of validation, finally seeing evidence that your reduced pursuit produced some genuine effect, alongside continued uncertainty about what any of these responses ultimately mean for the relationship's future. Allowing both of these feelings to exist simultaneously, without rushing toward premature conclusion in either direction, reflects exactly the kind of measured, patient observation that has protected your own stability throughout this entire process. Let's talk about what specifically to watch for that would distinguish genuine, sustainable change from a temporary reaction destined to fade once the initial disruption settles and old patterns feel safe to resume. Genuine change typically includes discomfort tolerance, a willingness to sit with difficult conversations rather than retreating the moment discomfort arises. It includes proactive communication, initiating difficult conversations rather than only responding when directly confronted. It includes consistency that persists even during moments when your own attention happens to be genuinely elsewhere, rather than only appearing during moments specifically designed to test whether their effort still produces your anxious pursuit. Let's talk about the specific danger of becoming so focused on analyzing their behavior that you inadvertently recreate the same anxious monitoring your reduced pursuit was originally meant to interrupt. This danger deserves direct acknowledgement because it represents one of the more subtle ways old patterns can reassert themselves, even while appearing superficially to represent genuine progress. If your attention remains constantly fixed on interpreting every message, every silence, every shift in their behavior, searching for definitive proof about what it all means, this intense analytical focus, however sophisticated it might feel compared to earlier, more obviously anxious behavior, still centers their behavior as the primary source of your own emotional regulation. Let's talk about what genuinely helps maintain balance throughout this observation period, allowing you to notice relevant patterns without becoming consumed by constant analysis. Setting specific, limited times to consciously reflect on the situation, rather than allowing analysis to occur continuously throughout every waking moment, helps considerably. Maintaining full engagement with your own separate life, your own goals, your own relationships, ensures that your attention remains appropriately distributed, rather than becoming disproportionately consumed by monitoring a single relationship's evolving dynamics. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own confidence throughout this entire process, because confidence here deserves recognition as an outcome worth valuing, independent of whatever ultimately happens within the relationship itself. Successfully maintaining your own groundedness while observing their various responses, resisting the pull to immediately relax boundaries at the first sign of encouraging behavior, resisting the pull to become anxiously reactive at the first sign of testing or withdrawal, builds genuine confidence in your own capacity for emotional regulation, confidence that remains yours regardless of how this specific situation eventually resolves. Let's talk about what it means to eventually release the need to definitively predict or categorize their behavior at all, allowing the relationship simply to unfold naturally, while you remain anchored in your own life, regardless of its direction. This release represents perhaps the most advanced stage of the process being described throughout this entire discussion, moving beyond even careful, measured observation into a place of genuine equanimity, where their behavior, whatever form it ultimately takes, no longer requires your intense analytical attention in order for you to remain stable and secure. Let's talk about the specific way mutual friends or social circles sometimes become involved during this period, either intentionally or inadvertently, because this added dimension deserves its own careful consideration. Sometimes information travels indirectly, comments made to mutual acquaintances eventually reaching you, revealing something about how they are processing this shift, even without direct communication occurring between the two of you. This indirect information deserves the same measured skepticism applied to direct communication, recognizing that secondhand accounts often carry distortion, exaggeration, or incomplete context that makes them considerably less reliable than direct, sustained observation of actual behavior over time. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own social presentation during this period. Whether you find yourself, consciously or not, adjusting how you present your own life in ways designed to be noticed or to provoke a particular reaction. This deserves honest self examination because performing a version of thriving specifically for their benefit, rather than genuinely investing in your own well being for its own sake, represents another subtle way old patterns of centering their attention can resurface, even while appearing superficially like healthy detachment. Genuine groundedness does not require an audience in order to feel complete. Let's talk about the specific role self-doubt continues to play throughout this process, because even significant progress rarely eliminates self-doubt entirely, particularly during moments when their behavior becomes genuinely confusing or contradictory. Noticing self doubt without allowing it to override your own accumulated observations represents an important ongoing skill throughout this process. Self doubt might whisper that you are overanalyzing, that their testing behavior is simply normal relationship friction, that their increased effort definitely proves genuine change has occurred. Gently questioning these doubts, returning to your own accumulated evidence rather than being swept away by momentary uncertainty, protects the clarity you have worked hard to develop. Let's talk about what specific self talk might help during moments when their behavior feels particularly difficult to interpret. When you genuinely cannot tell whether you are witnessing testing, genuine effort, or defensive withdrawal. Reminding yourself that time will eventually clarify what currently feels ambiguous, that you do not need to resolve this uncertainty immediately through anxious analysis, that your own well being does not actually depend on accurately predicting their next move. All of this provides useful grounding during moments when the temptation toward anxious overanalysis feels particularly strong. Let's talk about the specific way this entire experience, navigated with patience and groundedness rather than anxious reactivity, ultimately serves your capacity to recognize genuine relational health in the future, whether within this relationship or within others that might eventually develop. Having witnessed firsthand how various responses can look similar on the surface while stemming from entirely different underlying motivations, you develop a considerably more sophisticated capacity to withhold premature judgment, to wait for sustained evidence rather than reacting immediately to encouraging or discouraging signals, a skill that serves you well far beyond this single situation. Let's talk about what remains true, regardless of which specific response you ultimately witness from them. Testing that eventually stops, effort that either sustains or fades, withdrawal that either persists or eventually resolves into something more genuine. What remains true is that you have already demonstrated, through your own actions, a capacity for self-respect and groundedness that represents genuine, lasting personal growth. Growth that exists independent of their response, and that will continue serving you regardless of how this particular situation ultimately concludes. Let's talk about the specific quality of peace available once you have fully internalized that their next move, whatever it turns out to be, does not actually determine your own worth or your own capacity for a fulfilling life. This peace does not require certainty about the future. It requires simply trusting that you can navigate whatever unfolds, drawing on the same groundedness and self-respect that allowed you to stop chasing in the first place, regardless of how unpredictable or confusing their subsequent behavior might continue to be. Let's talk about what happens specifically during the earliest hours and days immediately following your first significant instance of not chasing, because this initial period often carries its own distinct emotional texture, worth examining separately from the longer-term patterns discussed throughout this conversation. During these early hours, you might notice an unusual hyper-awareness of your phone, a heightened sensitivity to any notification, even ones entirely unrelated to them. Evidence that your nervous system remains on high alert, even while your conscious mind has made the decision to stop actively pursuing contact. This hyper-awareness typically settles gradually, rather than disappearing immediately, requiring patience with your own physiological process, even as your behavioral choices have already shifted toward greater groundedness. Let's talk about the specific role sleep and rest play during this transitional period, because disrupted sleep often accompanies significant shifts in relational patterns, particularly during the earliest days when your nervous system is still adjusting to the absence of its previous, familiar, anxious activity. Prioritizing rest, even when sleep feels elusive, supports the broader nervous system regulation this entire process requires, providing your body the recovery time necessary to gradually settle into this new, less anxiously activated baseline. Let's talk about what specific physical sensations commonly accompany this transition, because naming these sensations directly can help reduce the additional anxiety that often accompanies unexplained physical discomfort. A persistent low-grade tension in the chest or stomach, difficulty concentrating fully on unrelated tasks, a kind of background hum of unresolved alertness. All of these commonly accompany significant shifts in attachment-related behavior, reflecting genuine physiological adjustment rather than indicating anything has gone wrong with your process. Let's talk about the specific value of external validation from trusted sources during this particular period. Not validation seeking from the person you have stopped chasing, but validation and support from friends, family, or professional support who can help affirm that what you are experiencing, however uncomfortable, represents a normal, healthy part of this particular transition, rather than something requiring alarm or immediate reversal. Let's talk about what happens to your relationship with hope throughout this entire observation period, because hope deserves its own careful examination, given how central it has likely been throughout the earlier stages of this relationship. Hope does not need to be eliminated entirely in order for this process to succeed. It simply needs to be held more loosely, more provisionally, allowed to exist without dictating your immediate behavior, without requiring urgent action in response to every fluctuation in their apparent interest or investment. Let's talk about what genuine self-trust looks like, specifically during moments when their behavior seems to be sending mixed or contradictory signals. Moments when testing, increased effort, and apparent withdrawal seem to be occurring almost simultaneously, creating a confusing, difficult to interpret overall picture. Self-trust here means allowing this confusion to exist without forcing premature resolution, trusting that continued patient observation, rather than anxious immediate interpretation, will eventually reveal a clearer overall pattern worth responding to appropriately. Let's talk, finally, about the specific relief available once you recognize that predicting their exact next move was never actually the point of this entire process. The point was always your own transformation, your own capacity to remain grounded regardless of what unfolds, your own reclaimed investment in your own life and well-being. Whatever they do next remains genuinely important information worth noting and considering, but it no longer holds the power it once did to determine your own emotional stability, your own sense of worth, or your own capacity to move forward with confidence, regardless of how this particular situation ultimately resolves. Let's talk about the specific way this transformation tends to influence how you handle similar dynamics in entirely unrelated relationships, whether with friends, family members, or colleagues, because the skill of tolerating uncertainty without anxious pursuit generalizes considerably beyond romantic contexts alone. Once you have practiced this particular kind of patience and groundedness within the specific, difficult context of this relationship, You often find yourself applying similar patience elsewhere, less inclined toward anxious overreaching in friendships that feel imbalanced, more capable of allowing other relationships to reveal their genuine nature through patient observation rather than through anxious overinvestment. Let's talk about what it means to hold genuine curiosity about their eventual response, rather than either desperate hope or defensive cynicism. Because curiosity represents perhaps the healthiest possible orientation toward observing whatever unfolds next. Curiosity allows you to notice patterns clearly, without becoming emotionally destabilized by any particular observation, treating this entire situation as genuinely interesting information about human psychology and relational dynamics, rather than as a referendum on your own worth or a countdown towards some urgently needed resolution. Let's talk about the specific value of documenting your own observations throughout this process, whether through journaling or simply through periodic, honest reflection. Tracking what you actually witness rather than relying entirely on memory, which tends to be considerably influenced by whatever emotional state you happen to be experiencing in any given moment. This documentation provides a more reliable, more objective record to reference when trying to assess genuine patterns over time, protecting against the natural tendency to weight recent, emotionally charged interactions more heavily than the fuller, more complete picture actually warrants. Let's talk, one final time, about what genuinely lasting empowerment looks like throughout this entire process. Empowerment that does not depend on successfully predicting their next move. Empowerment that does not require any particular response from them at all in order to remain fully intact. This empowerment comes entirely from within, built through the accumulated evidence of your own capacity to remain grounded, to observe patiently, to require genuine evidence before extending renewed trust, and to continue investing fully in your own life, regardless of whatever direction this particular relationship ultimately takes. This empowerment, once genuinely built, remains yours permanently, available in every future circumstance requiring exactly this kind of patient, self-respecting strength. And so, if you recognize yourself in any part of what has been described here, if you have recently stopped chasing and now find yourself watching carefully for what happens next, trust that whatever unfolds, testing, increased effort, or withdrawal, you have already accomplished something genuinely significant simply by interrupting a pattern that was slowly costing you your own peace and self-respect. Whatever they do next belongs entirely to them to determine. What belongs to you, regardless of their response, is the continued choice to remain grounded, to remain invested in your own life, and to require genuine, sustained evidence before ever again allowing anxious pursuit to determine how you spend your own precious time and attention.